Pleasure to be here. Thank you for coming. To begin, I take the title of this series very seriously, Leaders and Legacies of the Civil War, and I tend to want to talk about what happened after the Civil War, and I've also been lately interested in trying to find out something about American foreign policy in the last few decades of the 19th century, and that's what stimulated me to create this talk. It's going to be a survey of various aspects or areas of American involvement in the world in the period between 1861 and, let's say, 1898 or just before. And when I took this project on, I just had a general idea. Okay, I'm going to do something about American foreign policy. Didn't really have a working title, and this was the working title I came up with. But anyway, I wanted to use this as a teaser. William Seward and Hawaii, and Benjamin Harrison, Venezuela, and the American Empire, but of course, there's a whole lot of stuff in between. So this was just intended as a teaser. So, according to the late historian Walter Lefebvre, professor of American history at Cornell University, the foreign policy of the United States from 1861 to 1898 was consciously bent, he says consciously bent, on the acquisition, the expansion of an American economic empire which would encompass the entire earth. This talk will consider that thesis by looking at different regions of the world and aspects of, again, American involvement and progress technologically and otherwise as America, United States, expanded its commercial ties around the world. We're going to begin by looking at some of the intellectual foundations of American foreign policy in this period. I'm going to discuss four influential thinkers on political, economic, and social ideas, and they were Frederick Jackson Turner, Josiah Strong, Brooks Adams, and Alfred Thayer Mahan. We'll begin with Frederick Jackson Turner. He was a PhD candidate at the University of Wisconsin in the 1890s, and in 1893 he delivered a talk at the Columbian Exposition, and the title of it was The Significance of the Frontier in American History. The basic idea was that with the closing of the American frontier, we also closed the first period of American history. Up until the 1890s and the closing of the western frontier, the populating of it with Americans of European descent, free land encompassed American individualism, nationalism, and democracy. Everyone had an opportunity to earn a competency, to do well in the United States under its political and economic system. And the frontier, so think of the frontier as a moving object. First the Appalachians, then the Trans-Mississippi, then the far west. The frontier, over time, created a safety valve as the eastern, the original part of the country, became more and more crowded. And it was Turner's thesis that with the closing of the frontier in the 1890s, that safety valve was no longer there. Most of the political class and intellectual class of the late 19th century in the United States would not have favored the acquisition of non-continental territory for the United States. In other words, island colonies, that sort of thing. We were East Coast to West Coast, that was continental, that was fair, but beyond that, we don't want to go. So what do? In order to continue our system, to continue the prosperity of the American people, continue our democratic ideals, we expand not in territory, but in trade. So expansion in the form of trade instead of landed settlement was ultimately offered as the answer to the dilemma of what happens when the continental United States no longer provides a safety valve for our people. That's his idea. That's his main idea, and that's floating around in the 1880s, 1890s. The next person we're going to look at is Josiah Strong. He was a congregational minister and a missionary for the Home Missionary Society. He wrote extensively on the idea that through the work of American missionaries and others, the heathen world, places like China, Japan, Korea, and most of Africa, were to be Christianized and thereby civilized. In terms of the United States, by propelling American ideals and institutions, its commercial prowess in these new areas of exploration, we would also encourage the development of trade with those nations, with China, Japan, Korea, etc. So Christianity and commerce extended the blessing of American democratic institutions and economic well-being. The third gentleman I would like to point out here is Brooks Adams, grandson and great-grandson of presidents. I want to mention the Adams National Historic Park sent me this image of him just the other day because I was looking for something that showed him as a relatively young man. You look him up and you see pictures of him as about a 15-year-old or as a very old man. But here he is in 1896 when he published The Law of Civilization and Decay. So he's in his 30s then. Essentially the theme of that book was that humans physically spread, their societies become more complex and more centralized. Economic matters become most important, and for a time, a nation or a group of nations with powerful economies dominate other nations. These very complex commercial societies also concentrate wealth and neglect the creative and the spiritual values. Greed leads to distrust and dishonesty, and societies crumble. The concentration of wealth in a few hands leads to drastic inequalities, and that could ultimately lead to revolution in some form. And so there's another idea that's percolating in the 1880s and 90s, because in the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, we have things like the B&O Railroad strike, first major labor strike in the United States. A lot of violence, a lot of death, a lot of destruction of property. We have the Haymarket riot. We have the Pullman strike. We have Coxey's army marching to Washington to demand better conditions for laborers and so forth. And so here are signs in his time that our economic system is out of balance and it could cause revolution in our country. The last thing someone like Adams, whose great-grandfather helped to form this country, would want to see. Something else that he said that I thought was really very interesting for someone from his time, he predicted that eventually New York would be the center of trade in the world and that China would challenge the Anglo-Saxon world. I just use that as a bit of an aside. The final person I want to discuss briefly here is Alfred Thayer Mahan. He's a Navy man, and he believed that an economically strong nation is a nation that is engaged in trade, and that a nation engaged in trade needed a strong navy to support a strong merchant marine. A strong navy and merchant marine requires the establishment of naval bases on islands around the world, especially in the Pacific and the Caribbean. He also believed in trade agreements that were reciprocal. So the word reciprocity is bandied about quite a lot in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Reciprocal agreements. We lower tariffs to encourage the increase of trade between nations. A nation like the United States, a very advanced manufacturing nation, will engage in less advanced nations for raw materials, for example. Cut those nations certain kinds of breaks on things that are being traded so that we're not charging high taxes, high tariffs on products. That's the basic idea. Another thing that's floating around in this period is social Darwinism. And I'm just going to touch on this very briefly. So the idea is that we have a belief in the survival of the fittest peoples. And of course, people in Great Britain and in the United States believe that we are the fittest peoples on the earth, and that together the English and the Americans will again civilize the rest of the world. Military force is an expression of fitness, of the survival of the fittest peoples. So military force is another key element of what's happening in this time period. Now we're going to jump back to the 1860s. By the 1860s, the United States stretched from the Atlantic to the Pacific. We had rich mineral, farming, and grazing lands, and the economy of the United States was highly productive, both agriculturally and industrially. Industrial activity was increasing rapidly with the onset and in the years following the Civil War, and it was perceived that the United States needed markets abroad to sell its excess of goods, again, both agricultural but also industrial. Into the 1880s at least, however, I will just mention, American agricultural surpluses were the most important factor in our export trade. Just a real brief statistic here. From 1874 until 1898, exports exceeded imports almost every year except in 1875, 1880, and 1893. Now, by one accounting, exports increased 200% between 1870 and 1880. There are other accounts that will indicate that with all of that, exports increased as a total representation of the gross national product of the country by only a little more than 7%. So a little back and forth there. But this is something that is perceived, this idea that we need to increase our exports because we can't consume everything we produce. So we need markets. By the 1880s, Americans were aware that our westward continental expansion was coming to an end. We'd built the transcontinental railroad, we'd linked the east with the west, we are populating, and at some point, we're not going to be able to continue that westward movement of the population. It's going to grow in place. There were periodic panics and depressions throughout American history, basically on a once every 20-year cycle. And again, the American business community is very interested in arresting that cycle of once every 20 years we're going to have a depression, and they're thinking acquiring foreign markets is what's going to help solve that problem. Another factor in this growing interest in expanding our trade is our awareness of the dominance of Great Britain, of England, in Latin America, which is part of the Western Hemisphere, which is part of what the United States has always wanted to be in control of, right? The Monroe Doctrine and all of that. We want to be able to control the Western Hemisphere. But we've got, in particular, Great Britain, not just Great Britain, France as well, Germany, competing and establishing all kinds of trade ties in Latin America. And the United States thinks, leaders in the United States think, well, that's not really good for the United States. So we want to get involved in that game too. So now we're going to come to somebody who everyone will, I think, recognize, William Seward, Secretary of State, between 1861 and 1869. He had a vision of the American empire that was followed by every Secretary of State and President from his time into the next century. He saw the need for those foreign markets for American agriculture and industrial goods in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, and of course in Hawaii. The vision that William Seward had included the building of that railroad from the East Coast to the West Coast to promote settlement of the American continent and the movement of goods. William Seward believed, and he was not alone, that Canada would probably someday become part of the United States. It would be absorbed into the United States, economically certainly, but perhaps also politically. He believed, and many succeeding secretaries of states and presidents would agree, that the United States could not afford to have any Latin American colonies. They are, after all, non-continental, would be non-continental, and more to the point perhaps, or equally to the point, they are people of different races. And we've just ended a war in which race played the major role. So we don't want to now go into other parts of the world, Latin America, what have you, acquiring territories peopled with people who are non-Western European based. He believed that the United States needed to build a canal in Central America to be a southern approach to the Pacific and to Asia, in particular China. And again, this is an idea that was in the United States mindset well before the Civil War. And there was the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty of 1850, which was a treaty between the United States and Great Britain for joint control of a canal to be built in Nicaragua someday. But it would be jointly controlled by Great Britain and the United States, and it would be in Nicaragua, not in Panama. Alaska would be the northern approach to Asia. And so here we see Seward's folly. And you see Mr. Seward there on the left and President Andrew Johnson on the right, and they're trying to push a treaty through the United States Senate, which they ultimately did. But of course, Johnson was very unpopular in the country for his views on Reconstruction and his continuing debates with the United States Congress. But again, Seward wanted to have Alaska as a northern approach to Asia. Alaska was a territory, a land rich in timber, gold, fish, furs, and ice, all useful commodities. And he believed that there were millions of Asians who would become great customers for everything from ice to fish. And so the purchase of Alaska would be a good thing for the United States. But as you can see, it's Seward's folly. Well, he engaged in a public relations campaign to push the treaty through the Senate. He employed a number of newspaper editors and prominent officials. So, for example, Henry J. Raymond of the New York Times editorialized that the purchase of Alaska meant prospects for our Japan and China trade would be greatly increased. Lippincott's magazine suggested that the purchase of Alaska meant that in a few years we will control the Pacific coast as effectively as we control the Atlantic. Robert J. Walker, a former Treasury Secretary and financier, asserted that Alaska would be the theater of our greatest triumphs in the Pacific. where we will have soon no formidable rival. The result would be political and commercial control of the world. So Seward's got his men lined up, wanting to get Alaska. The Russians, of course, owned Alaska. Why would they want to sell it to the United States? Well, first of all, let's back up, and I think this is rather interesting. Traditionally, relations between the United States and Russia until the end of the 19th century were very friendly. Both were very large and expansive countries. Both were melting pots with multiple ethnic groups within their populations. Both shared an isolationist spirit, and both were jealous of England. Both were jealous of England, and I'm going to try to come back to that as much as I can. The rivalry between the United States and England is something that was at the beginning of our forming as a nation, and it continued right until the end of the 19th century. The Russians saw Alaska, much like Seward, as a potentially profitable but immediately expensive colonial stepchild. They were willing to unload it. If Russia got involved in a war with England, Alaska, there on the west coast of Canada, right, would be easy prey for the British Navy, which of course controlled Canada. Selling it to the U.S. removed for the Russians a problem in case there would be some kind of a war with England in the future. So there's Alaska, the northern approach to China, Japan, Korea. Seward's successors as secretaries of state all agreed with him and all had the same interests as he in Canada, in Hawaii, in Samoa, in that Isthmian Canal, and in the islands of the Caribbean. So let's start with Canada. I just, again, think this is very interesting. Hope you do too. Seward believed that the purchase of Alaska was a step in the eventual annexation of the Northwest Territory of Canada to form, at the very least, a Pacific coastline of the United States for the United States, stretching from California to Alaska. Hamilton Fish, Grant's Secretary of State who succeeded Seward, had an equal interest in Canada. And again, many Americans at that time believed that Canada would eventually be annexed to the United States. Annexation would end disputes regarding fishing rights on both coasts and lessen English influence in North America. So we're getting back at England again. James G. Blaine, who was James Garfield's Secretary of State, felt exactly the same way. Really disliked the Canadians, not fond of the English at all. So a big factor in American foreign policy at this time was the political and economic rivalry that the United States had with Great Britain. Hayes's Secretary of State, William Evarts, wanted to conclude trade agreements with China to compete with the English who were already there. James G. Blaine, Garfield Secretary of State, wanted to establish free trade agreements, reciprocity agreements with many nations in Latin America. This would be a counterweight to British influence in Mexico, in Chile, in Brazil, and elsewhere in Central and South America. Frederick Frelinghuysen, Arthur's Secretary of State, attempted to bypass that Clayton-Bulwer Treaty of 1850 with a new treaty with Nicaragua, excluding the British, to build a joint Nicaraguan-American canal. Went nowhere, but he tried. Cleveland's Secretaries of State, Walter Gresham and Richard Olney, clashed with England over Venezuela, and we're going to learn more about that in just a minute. And James G. Blaine and John Foster, who were Benjamin Harrison's Secretaries of State, competed for influence with England in Samoa, and Hawaii. And I've got to ask Dr. Foster if Secretary of State Foster is a relative.
No, he's from a better class of people than
Okay.
my family.
All right. Okay.
We were still trotting around the bogs in Ireland at that point.
Okay. All right. So now I've put up a map of Hawaii. So that's right. I got the pointer. So let's find Hawaii, right? So you can see the coastline of the United, you can see the coast of the United States. There's Hawaii. In 1842, President John Tyler recognized the independence of the Hawaiian Islands, the Hawaiian Kingdom, not only from the U.S., but also from Europeans, from France and England in particular. At the same time, we had been and we would continue to engage in trade with the Hawaiian people. Tyler's policy of recognition and insurance of the independence of Hawaii, the Hawaiian Islands, was the policy of every one of his successors down to Benjamin Harrison and William McKinley. Tyler's pronouncement reinforced an American sphere of influence that already existed. We had trade already with the Hawaiian Islands by the 1840s. There were American missionaries who were working in Hawaii to Christianize and civilize the Hawaiians, to introduce American ideals and American institutions. So really from the 1830s and 40s onward, Hawaii was being steadily Americanized. But just to be clear, American missionaries did not favor annexation of the Hawaiian Islands. Again, they're non-continental. They are of a different race. So we want to engage in them, engage with them in trade. We may even want to say control them economically, but we do not want to take them on as a political unit of the United States. Trade was conducted primarily between Hawaii and the West Coast, primarily between Oregon and California in the mid to late 19th century. The original products to be traded were involved with the whaling industry, but ultimately it was sugar that became the primary resource that the Hawaiians offered to the United States, to California and Oregon. While all of this is happening in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, so forth, the increased trade, more and more missionaries, more and more Americans are settling in Hawaii, but also Germans, French, English. The population of native Hawaiians steadily drops as foreign nationals increase in population in the Hawaiian Islands in the late 19th century. There was actually a formal annexation treaty, however, that was entertained during the Pierce administration in 1853. Again, it went nowhere. Again, non-continental, foreign peoples. We don't want to go there. But there was serious talk about that at the time. Because the idea was, we want to control Hawaii. We want them to somehow be a way station on the way to China. And we don't want the English, and we don't want the French, or the Japanese, eventually, to control the Hawaiian Islands. So it's the United States that continues to engage in trade agreements and to insist on the independence of the Hawaiians politically, right, in order to prevent other nations from controlling Hawaii. Pearl Harbor, by the way. Americans, businessmen and politicians, saw the benefit of Hawaii as a stopover for ships on their way to trade with China, Japan, and eventually Korea, certainly by the 1880s. And so there was a desire on the part of many businessmen, American politicians, to have some sort of permanent port at Hawaii for the purpose of refueling and re-provisioning American trading vessels. In 1886, the Cleveland administration engaged in a trade agreement to include exclusive rights to Pearl Harbor on Oahu Island as a coaling and repair station. And during the debates over trade and Pearl Harbor, it was stated anew that the Hawaiian Islands could never be allowed to become a menace or a danger, a source of danger to the United States. The United States Senate ratified a renewal of a reciprocity trade agreement of 1875 in the Cleveland administration, with the provision that Pearl Harbor would be leased to the United States for a naval base. Now, in the succeeding administration of Benjamin Harrison, there was an overthrow of the Hawaiian monarch, the Queen, Liliuokalani. The Harrison administration employed the U.S. Navy to help that along. Cleveland, of course, was elected to a second term, defeating Harrison in 1892, and so the annexation treaty that the Harrison administration had developed was rejected by Grover Cleveland in 1893 because he said it was an illegal revolution that was assisted by the United States Navy, and that was an immoral thing to do. We shouldn't do it. We should be a moral nation. And so Cleveland said no to annexation of Hawaii at that time. In the McKinley administration, which followed Cleveland's second administration in 1898, Hawaii was finally annexed because it was seen at that point as strategically important as a gateway to Asia, and it would also help in the protection of an eventual canal somewhere in Central America. And finally, it's annexed because there are fears that the growing importance of Japan in Asia was a threat to the United States' interests in the Hawaiian Islands. So if we annex it, it's ours, and that ends that problem. So annexation took place after the Spanish-American War, August 12th, 1898. So now we come to Samoa. The American government recognized the potential of the Samoan Islands to be, like Hawaii, a way station on the way to Asia. During the Grant administration in 1872, a treaty was initiated to give the United States a harbor at Pago Pago. The treaty to do that was ratified in 1878 when Hayes was president. By this time, Great Britain and Germany also had treaties with the Samoans. So again, I just want to point out that it's becoming increasingly clear in the late 19th century in the United States that Great Britain and Germany and Japan are all major players in international affairs, and they are rivals. Samoa was on that commercial highway that led to Asia. And once that canal was built in Central America, again, like Hawaii, it would be of even greater importance in protecting American interests in the Pacific and along that canal in the Caribbean. Just a few words on China and Korea. American railroad entrepreneurs wanted to build railroads in China and Korea in the late 19th century because they would be wedges for the introduction of American manufactured goods into those nations. American railroads would lessen the effect of the partitioning of China by European nations like France, like Germany, like Great Britain. So, Russia. All of those nations were essentially controlling provinces of China. And the Chinese people are suffering thereby. And of course, the Chinese nation is trying to reestablish itself as an independent nation not controlled by foreigners. The United States wanted to have a trade role in China, but it did not want to politically control any of the territory of China. But again, economic interests like railroads would promote trade without promoting political involvement in the Chinese nation. For many, many years, Korea had been controlled by the Chinese, but then come along the Japanese in the, let's see, there's Korea, right? Then come along the Japanese, who eventually gain a lot of interest in Korea. The United States is aware of all of this. And in 1878, President Hayes sent Admiral Robert Schufelt to Korea to establish a trade agreement with the Hermit Kingdom. So this is a very isolated nation even then in the 19th century, just like it is now, at least the northern part, right? Ultimately, the treaty was ratified in 1882. The long anticipated robust trade with China became a reality in the 1890s. Trade with China tripled in value between 1890 and 1897 to nearly $12 million. Still, it's less than 0.5% of all American trade. In this period, and we're talking about all this trading in new markets and what have you, it remained a fact that America's major trading partners were England, Western European nations like France and Germany, and Canada. All right, so there's the Caribbean. Experience with Confederate blockade runners emphasized the desirability of having naval and coaling stations in the Caribbean. William Seward attempted to gain such an advantage in 1867 by negotiating a treaty with Denmark to buy the Danish West Indies, the Virgin Islands, but nothing came of that at that time. They were actually bought in 1914. In 1869, Seward tried to buy a port along the Bay of Samana in Santo Domingo, today's Dominican Republic. So there's the Dominican. I don't know how well this is showing up, but there it is, Dominican Republic. Frelinghuysen was unsuccessful in getting reciprocity treatment agreements with Cuba and Puerto Rico, pacts that would bring them into the economic but not the political control of the United States. So again, Frelinghuysen is Arthur's Secretary of State. He's trying to get trade agreements in this region for economic purposes, but again, we don't want political control because then, you buy it, you own it, so then we own these nations which are of Latin and black origin, and we don't want that, especially in the years just after the Civil War, where we have fought a war that split the country, and it was over the issue of race and slavery. So economic interest, economic control, bring them into the American economic orbit? Yes. Control them politically? No. And finally, during the Harrison administration, Secretary of State Blaine sought to acquire a naval station at Mole St. Nicholas in Haiti. Right there. There we go. All right. Now we come to another topic that I have found interesting over time, and it is the U.S. Navy. So just a bit of a review from earlier talks that I've given. To protect its efforts to support its commercial and financial expansion in Latin America, Hawaii, Samoa, and Asia, the United States needed, so it was perceived, a stronger, more modern Navy. Now, in the immediate post-Civil War era, the Navy returned to its pre-war mission of simply cruising the American coasts, Pacific, Atlantic, Caribbean. We're staying close in. We have relatively shallow ports, so we're not too concerned about being attacked in our ports. There is some concern about that, but our ports are fairly shallow, and these other navies, which are already transitioning to steel, simply cannot get into our ports to bomb us, that sort of thing. At least that's the theory. Part of the reason that we maintain this coastal cruising and reduced navy in the post-Civil War period is simply cost cutting, and also the idea, which I think is somewhat common, that after a war which has dragged on and cost many lives and a lot of treasure, there's a reaction. People do not want to invest. The American people did not want to invest a great deal in military affairs. So we maintain a rather simple navy. We did not at this time, the 1860s and 70s following the war, want to build a navy to rival France or Great Britain, which certainly had large navies. Our interests were in the Western Hemisphere. We did not fear attack from Great Britain or France per se. So there's no need for us to have this huge navy, this modern navy. That's the thought in the late 1860s and 1870s. Our navy at that time, some said, was sufficient for defensive purposes of a peaceful people who had no colonies. We want to maintain control of the American hemisphere, but we don't want to compete with Europe. By 1880, that began to change. By 1880, there's a huge surplus in the American Treasury. There's a growth in foreign trade, and we begin to see that over time, the United States is going to become increasingly in conflict with European nations and even with some Latin American nations like Chile, for example. So in 1881, there's a call for a modern navy. And one of the things that I like to mention when I'm at the Garfield site, one of the, achievements, if you will, of President Garfield in the brief time that he served as president, he initiated the first steps in the creation of the modern steel navy. He recognized, and Secretary of State Blaine recognized, that we needed to modernize our navy in order to compete against our arch rival, the British, and other powerful nations like France, like Japan, like Germany, like Chile. So, we begin that process in the Garfield administration. Garfield, Blaine, Secretary of the Navy William Hunt, they were all nationalists, they were all mercantilists. They wanted to engage in trade, they wanted to promote the importance of the United States in world affairs. And so we begin to see this effort to build a steel navy. There are a lot of problems in this period. There are fits and starts in the 1880s over the steel navy, in part because of rivalries between the Democratic and Republican parties who are arguing over the size of this navy and the pace at which it's going to be built. And then there's the practical issues of how to do it. Simply, there are no plants, there are no manufacturing facilities in the United States in the 1880s, the early 1880s, that could produce the steel plates that could shield, provide the shielding, of the ships. So we can't roll the steel. We have no forges to make the big guns that go along with the big ships. That's going to change as the late 1880s and early 1890s get underway. 1885, the Navy recommended one seagoing, that is to say beyond the coast, armored vessel. Now again we come back to Alfred Mahan. 1890, he published The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783. And in it, he offered a two-part philosophy about the United States in world politics. The prosperity and national destiny of the United States are founded on commercial imperialism. We're going out there and we're going to trade with everybody. And the Navy should defend our commerce in transit offensively, not just defensively. Merchant vessels must have secure ports as destination for the protection from blockades by foreign nationals. To avoid this, we needed ports and colonies. So we're going to establish ports in various colonies in order to promote our trade. He recognized that there was a restless spirit stirring among other Western peoples for commercial extension, for colonies, for influence in distant regions. And this would bring a collision with ourselves. He perceived threats from England, Germany, France, and that rising nation in Asia, Japan. We needed adequate military forces, including a powerful navy, and we needed a martial spirit in this country. That's his idea. Well, Benjamin Harrison and his Secretary of the Navy, Benjamin Franklin Tracy, were strong advocates of an offensive steel navy. Cruisers along the coast were not enough. We must have armored battleships to defeat an enemy fleet. So there are Benjamin Harrison and Benjamin Tracy. In 1890, the Naval Policy Board report to Tracy stated that we are entering a period of intense commercial competition and we need more ships. Naval Board thought 200 would be adequate. Well, they got 4 battleships. 4 battleships during the Harrison administration, but it was a start. And again, this is all for the promotion of American trade. During the second Cleveland administration, he and his Secretary of the Navy, though Democrats, were also in favor of building a strong Navy for the United States for the protection, for the expansion of commerce, and also to alleviate, we want to alleviate the depression that hit the country in 1893 just as Grover Cleveland's second administration began. So how do you put people to work? Have them building ships. During that second Cleveland administration, another 7 battleships were put into being. What's the word I want? Congress passed the legislation to create them. So we have another 7 battleships on board during the second Cleveland administration. Now we're going to continue with the Cleveland administration and talk about Venezuela in relation to Great Britain. Venezuela. In 1841, British surveyor Robert Schomburg included Point Barima on the eastern flank of Venezuela as the western limit of its colony, British Guiana. So basically it is in this area. This is the Orinoco River. So it's in this area that we're talking about, right here, you see, right there. So British Guiana and Venezuela. Venezuela protested because Point Barima controlled the entry to the Orinoco River. You see the Orinoco River there? Right there, okay, right. Which was the main way to engage in trade in the upper third of South America. Venezuela broke off diplomatic relations with Great Britain, and the dispute over that territory simmered for decades. 1893, the eastern region of Venezuela bordering Port Barima was in great unrest. The Venezuelan government could not surrender its boundary claim without risking revolution. And then in 1893, the British decided to claim more territory, 33,000 square miles, as part of British Guiana. That brought in the United States. Grover Cleveland considered Latin America as the best place to promote American trade and alleviate the depression through which the country was going at that time. He protested the British claims to that territory, which Venezuela claimed. If Britain through British Guiana, got that territory, they would control, Great Britain would control the entry into that northern third of South America, which meant American trade. That's how American trade was going to enter into that area of South America. So we don't want the British to have control of that area. So he protested. He announced his intention to promote restored diplomatic relations with Great Britain and Venezuela and to have the dispute arbitrated by the United States. And the British Secretary of State, Lord Salisbury, said, nope, not going to do that. Well, this led to a diplomatic dispute between the United States and Great Britain. The Secretary of State, Richard Olney, in July of 1895, sent a note to Lord Salisbury condemning the British for attempting to move the boundary of British Guiana farther west than the Schomburg line into Venezuelan territory. Cleveland followed up with a December message to Congress. We'd call it the State of the Union today. He followed up with a message in December to Congress and invoked the Monroe Doctrine, stating that where American interests were at stake, the United States had a right to protest or take stronger action, military action, and the British did not want to go to war with the United States, in part because they could see what was happening with Japan and could also see what was happening on the continent of Europe with Germany, and they were about to engage themselves in a war with the Boers in Africa. And so they did not want to take on the United States at this time. And then again, even though there's this rivalry, there's also this mutuality between the British people and the American people. We speak the same language, we have the same cultural roots, what have you, so forth. But Great Britain did not want to go to war with the United States over this, and so they eventually agreed to arbitration. 2 Brits, 2 Americans, and a Russian. The Brits actually got most of what they wanted, but they did not get control of Point Barima, and they did not get control of the river Orinoco, and that was the main thing. So the United States protected its economic interests here, its trading ability, by besting Great Britain in 1895 over this issue of territorial claims in Venezuela. About to finish up now with just a really quick look at what would eventually become the Panama Canal. So again, this is an idea that goes back really into the 18th century, but let's say even with the beginnings or from the 1850s with the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty. During the Hayes administration, the Secretary of State, William Evarts, saw that a non-American builder of a canal in Central America could threaten the commercial interests of the United States. Hayes protested any such possibility. The plan by the Frenchman Ferdinand de Lesseps, the man who built the Suez Canal, foundered in Central America, and so no canal was built under his leadership. Like Grant, Hayes, Garfield, and Arthur, and Harrison, and Cleveland, they all believed that the key to expanding American commerce in the Pacific and in Asia was through an Isthmian canal. Secretary of State Baird under Cleveland during his first administration said that a canal would give the U.S. a decided advantage over other nations in the future development of South American and Oriental countries, economic development. An Isthmian canal would allow the United States to compete with Europe at a distance for Asia. So there's an increased emphasis on markets for manufacturers and the Isthmian Canal to promote trade was just a theme throughout this period. So I'm going to just, again, wrap this up. We're not going to get into the story of the Panama Canal. That's much too big a story, and of course it ends in the 20th century, not in the Gilded Age. But I want to just conclude by coming back full circle to this gentleman, William Seward. By 1898, when the Spanish-American War was concluded, Seward's prediction, his vision, was largely in place. Hawaii, Alaska, Samoa, the Midway Islands were all stops along our trade routes to Latin America and Asia. We had successfully challenged Great Britain's economic and diplomatic power on the globe. The American Navy was now capable of defending our international trade. The Panama Canal, long a dream, was about to become a reality. The United States, in 1898, was poised to become a major economic, military, and diplomatic power on the earth. So he's a far-seeing man, and so were all the other men who followed in his footsteps. So I'm going to leave it there. That's the end of this talk. Well, you're welcome. Thank you.